Another one I found interesting. Not sure if anyone cares, but I wanna bump this thread. This event took place in late 2017 near Winter Park, Colorado at a family friend's cabin. The cabin is in a fairly remote place with few houses around. My family had spent the day sledding and came back to the cabin in the early evening. My parents and their friends were playing board games downstairs while my 3 siblings and their 2 friends were upstairs playing. So at some point my mom notices that my younger sister isn't playing with the rest of the kids and asks my other sister where she is. She said that she had gone into her room to listen to music, so my mother thought nothing of it. An hour or so goes by and my mom still hasn't heard or seen my sister, which was unusual as she generally wouldn't pass up time to play with her friends. So my mom checks the room to find that she was not there. Immediately my mom goes into a panic and starts screaming her name. Everyone in the house starts searching all of the rooms in the house, but they can't find her anywhere. My mom then singles out my other sister and asks her why she had lied about my sister's whereabouts. She claims she was being honest and that she had been listening to music. It's been about 2 hours since anyone has seen my sister. My mom goes outside to see if she can find her. Upon going outside, my mom tells me about the most horrifying thing she's ever seen. My sister is inside our car with her face plastered to the window, wide-eyed, screaming. My mom said it was like a horror movie. Everyone had assumed she had somehow locked herself in the car, not sure how a very intelligent 10-year-old girl would do that. Upon opening the door to the car and getting my sister out, my mom notices that she is not behaving normally and appears to be in some kind of trance. They walk her inside and begin asking her questions about what had happened, but she doesn't respond to anything. She remains in this trance state for maybe an hour or 2, so my mother gives up and puts her to bed. In the morning, my sister appeared to be acting somewhat normal, but seemed to be shaken up. My mother then asks her how she ended up in the car, but she doesn't remember. She said she only remembered one thing. As she was locked in the car, she saw him in Restall in black approach her. She said she was terrified and tried to get out of the car. Then the man in black came closer and told her that he would let her out, but she would have to do something for him. He held a black rose up to the window and told her to come out so he could give it to her. After this, my sister didn't remember anything. After hearing the story, my mom went outside to look around the car. To her amazement, she saw a trail of footsteps going from the car out past the house into the surrounding forest. No one had been playing or walking around that area before then, according to my mom, so she seemed very disturbed about the tracks. We still don't know what to think of this, but my mother said that the look on my sister's face in the car was sincerely terrifying. I'm not sure what actually happened that night. If I'm not wrong, Colorado is also a hot spot for missing 411 cases. I'm thankful my sister didn't become one of them, but maybe she saw something similar to what others have seen before their disappearance.
This is sadly the only story I have left, but at least it's a good one. Be last Christmas. Driving to GF's house 6 hours away. Decide to leave at midnight, so we can surprise the family. Be me, GF, and her sister and sister's BF in car. Driving along at around 3 a.m. Everyone is asleep except me. Middle of rural Texas, no towns or anything for miles. See car on side of road with hazards on. Decide to call the cops, just in case guy needs help. Right as I pull out my phone, I see some guy walking down the side of the road. Start slowing down to see if he needs help. Getting closer and see that this dude is at least 7 feet tall. Start feeling a bit antsy. Wake everyone up, just to help calm my nerves a bit. Getting closer and realize it's walking on all fours, almost like a skinny ape. GF yells at me to just keep going and call the police. Agree, but really want to get a better look at this thing. Down to about 5 miles per hour and about to pass by it. All of us look over and realize its face is human. It turns over to look at us, its face is uncanny valley as hell. Almost iRobot looking. All of us scream and I slam my foot on the gas. It whips its 5-foot-long arm at the car and clips the back. Speed the hell out of there, see it galloping towards us. Lose him in about a minute, but the girls in the car are crying and me and other guy are both freaking out. Finally call the cops and tell them about what happened. Said they'd go check it out. Never found out what happened with that. Still scares me when I think about it. Take a completely different route to get there now. Just to avoid that damn stretch of road. Really wish the damn cops had gotten back to me after they figured out what happened.
Pictures of the Devil's Stomping Ground, a famous location somewhere in the US where no shit will grow and weird things have been sighted at night. In my town we have an almost exactly similar clearing in the woods where nothing will grow. It is not too well known and is hard to get to, as it is far off the beaten trail. Me and my friend decided to spend a night there. We picked a clear night after a boiling hot day and set up camp at around 5. We shared a decently sized tent and for the most part just thought of it as a fun trip, a kinda cool way to waste a night in the woods. But the creepiness of the place, in retrospect, underlined everything we did. Telling ghost stories that night was not fun or exciting, it was uncomfortable and tense. For one thing, even during the day when birdsong filled the air in every other patch of the forest and the hum of insects followed you everywhere, it all faded into nothingness by the time you had reached the clearing. There was no noise. The sound of the wind was even so uncommon that when a light breeze swished through the nearby trees it gave us a shock. It was dead quiet and eerie as hell. One incident in particular tainted the night. As the sun was setting we glimpsed a stoat chasing a rabbit in the undergrowth. The rabbit was hopping very fast in a forward trajectory, toward the clearing. It was outrunning the stoat. As soon as it reached the border of the clearing, however, it made a sudden turn to avoid it, and fell over. As it was just about to get back up the stoat leapt on it and savaged it until it was nothing but a limp pile of bloody bone and fur. If the rabbit had just gone through the clearing it would probably have escaped. Yet it avoided that circle of dirt like it was hell on earth. Everything about the place seemed lifeless. The atmosphere was lightened only by me and my mate smoking some weed, and even then things didn't seem entirely right. That night, though, was one of the most disturbing experiences of my life. We were woken at around 3 in the morning to the sound of thumping against the thin walls of the tent as though something were being thrown. Turning on a torch we discovered that rocks, sometimes quite large ones, were hitting the tent. Some seemed to be being thrown, but most were coming straight down, as though being dropped from up high. Terrified we staggered out of the tent and started shouting at whoever was fucking with us to stop, shining the light all over the place. But we saw and heard no one. Even when we saw a rock shoot from out of the forest we saw no one throwing any. Soon we were being pelted with rocks that were, I can say with full honesty, being dropped on us. My friend received several bad bruises. I was quite unharmed. Returning to the tent only added to the terror though, as now the stones stopped coming down as heavy and some animal was wailing in the distance. It sounded almost human, like a woman screaming, but then it warped into a howl. The worst thing about the sound was how loud it was and how near it seemed to be, despite the echo. My friend was paralyzed with fear and I was whispering frantically at him that we would have to get out, escape. We couldn't even move however, and slowly the rocks stopped coming completely. The wailing, which seemed to loop like a broken record, became softer and softer and eventually we could no longer hear it at all. However, unnerving events continued till morning and we did not sleep. We heard at various times what sounded like a child laughing in the woods, and more than once my friend became nearly hysterical and said he saw hands press into the tent wall behind me. I did not ever see these, but I believe him.
Live in the Pacific Northwest. Be 20 years old, can't buy pistols yet. But still own a Mini 14. Decide to go camping, call up my 2 Hasguns friends, Mark and Adam. My friend Mark brought his AK, and 1K rounds of slob shit ammo. Adam comes from a wealthy family, so he brings a suppressed AR and a handheld PVS 14 night vision monocular. Lucky bastard. We all hop in my Jeep, and head up the highway. We turn off onto a gravel road, at a very remote stretch in a forested area. Eventually it turns into rough trail, with even a few downed trees on the path. Most of them my lifted Jeep can get over, but a few we had to push out of the way. Eventually after 30 to 45 minutes of off-roading, we get to my secret /K/location. It's way up in the hills, and it's very cool because you can shoot and camp in the same spot. Mark sent me a photo he took the first day, pic related. It sorta shows what the spot we were in looked like. Our campsite was positioned on the far point of a ridge, and surprisingly it was graveled for loggers. The only way to get to us is to go up a 45-degree cliff or come down the gravel road. I felt very safe, like I could defend such a location easily. One way in, one way out. We plink all day long, mostly at 100 yards. We tried some shots at the next ridge, over a mile away, but it was too far away to see the impacts. Few hours later it starts getting dark and our trigger fingers are getting sore, so Mark goes into the tree line to collect firewood. After about 30 minutes he comes limping back to camp, with a panicked look on his face. He's babbling about some bear that talks and won't calm down. He said he didn't get a good look at it, but heard what sounded like a bear crashing through the woods. Naturally, at the time he paused and listened to the sound of twigs snapping, figuring it was an animal. Then, in a little girl's voice, he heard "Follow me. Follow, 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 follow." Me voice cut off as if someone hit a switch. Mark thought it was us playing a joke on him, so he told the noise to fuck off. Then he heard, in his own voice, "Fuck ooff, fuck off." Nope.jpg, he sprinted back to camp, running so fast that he ate shit and sprained his ankle. Once Mark caught his breath and told us this, Adam says, "You're making it up to make your ankle mishap less embarrassing, stop bullshitting mate. If you don't believe me, let's go look." So we went into the tree line, heavily armed. We don't find anything except some tall scratches on a tree. They were about 8 feet up the tree, 3 of them parallel to each other. Deep enough to cause sap to run. Being a rational person, I explained that those were probably caused by elk rubbing their antlers. This pisses Mark off. All 3 of us take a leak on the tree, to mark our turf I guess. In hindsight this sounds really dumb. We start heading back, Adam keeps insisting that Mark made it all up, which makes him even more mad. Eventually we get back to camp, get a roaring fire going, and grab some beers that Adam brought. Mark calms down, and we all get back to our tents and pass out. That night was strangely uneventful, other than a weird smell that kept waking me up. It smelled like spoiled food, sour milk or something. I was too sleepy to get out of my tent. The next day was uneventful. Shoot, eat mrez, drink more beer, etc. I asked about the smell from the previous night, neither of them noticed it. Sun goes down, we're all sitting around a campfire passing around a bottle of whiskey. Suddenly I get hit with the smell again, and this time my buddies smell it too. We all get really uneasy, because a strange smell like that in a green, rain-drenched forest environment is very out of place. I feel the hair on my neck stand up, I glance at Adam and he hands us our rifles. We start hearing the distant crunch of gravel. It sounds like a lone 4-legged creature, with a slow rhythmic cadence. Elk. Bear. Something fairly large. It's pacing back and forth about 100 yards away, slowly getting closer. I chamber around, and the shuffling creature seemed to hear it, and back off a bit. At this point I realize I had forgotten my flashlight at home. I didn't notice because I used my phone the previous night. I ask, do either of you have a good light? Nope. The only thing between us that would reach that far was a crappy 100 lumen weapon light on the Arkansas. Fuck.jpg. Adam shined the light at the source of the sound, and it simply shuffled out of the light. We could never get a good look at it, but we could always hear the crunching of gravel, like a creature slowly circling its prey. I call out, "Hey, whoever are, please leave. You aren't welcome here. We're armed." We all hear, in a perfect emulation of my voice, "Welcome. Here. Armed ARMEDWELCOME. Tactical pants shit.jpg. The pacing, shuffling footsteps get closer. We all clicked the safeties off on our rifles, and spread out around the campfire. Suddenly, we hear the footsteps split up. "Fuck off, fuck off." Replayed in Mark's voice, WELCOOOME. Motion video, but garbled up. In my own. It sounded like a slow. Mark whispers to me, "Oh shit, there's two, what are those things?" I reply, "I'm gonna try to turn on my headlights, turn your light off for a sec." I hop in the Jeep, turn around, and aim the front of the car at the sound. I then turn off the engine, and listen, gravel crunching, about 80 yards away. 60 yards. 50 yards. 20 yards. Then I turned on the headlights, full high beams as well as the floodlights. I saw two bipedal creatures. One of them was very tall, a good foot or two taller than us. It had antlers that are 4 feet above its head, and dark brown fur. The other created looked different. It was wearing something red, and it looked like a human. I could only see it for a split second. As soon as the lights turned on, they both let out an ungodly cascading shriek that rang our ears, and ran out of the headlights with astonishing speed. We all shit bricks and fired into the dark. After our mags were empty, we reloaded and got as close as we could to the fire. Since the creatures avoided the light, the headlights did no good, so I turned them off to save the battery. An hour passed, nothing. I ran out of firewood and the nearest wood was far away, far enough to get myself killed. The fire was getting low. The crunching of gravel returned. This time it sounded like there were many of them. Slowly ambling just out of the reach of the weapon light. The light on Adam's AR flickered, and started to dim. "Do you have any more batteries?" I whispered. "I didn't think I'd need them." "I can't believe this is happening," he said. "You brought your night vision, right?" "Where is it?" I said. Adam's tent was a few dozen feet away from the fire, so we all went together while he retrieved it. The crunching drew in, edging closer and closer. The stench was so strong my eyes began to water. At last he found the NVGs in his pack, and we ran back to the safety of the fire. He fumbled with the switch for a bit, and couldn't find it. So he handed the NVGs to Mark so he could keep his light at the creatures. After Mark looked through it for a few moments, he dropped it and jumped into the car head first. He curled into a ball on the east, hysterical with fear, crying that we're all gonna die and shit like that. I found the device on the ground, picked it up and aimed it at the sounds. I could see them, pacing back and forth eagerly. They were all looking directly at me, as if they knew I could see them. They all looked like some horrible combination of elk, moose, and man. One had an opened up rib cage, yet did not bleed. Some were missing jaws, eyes, and other various extremities. They had arms that touched the ground with sheathed claws. I counted 4 of them, milling back and forth in odd twitching motions. I kept looking for some reason, when I really shouldn't have. My horrified curiosity getting the better of me. We were absolutely terrified up to that point. But then I saw the human, and my mouth dried with fear. It looked like Mark. It was hard to tell with the green tint of the NVGs, but it seemed to have the same red shirt as him, same height, same hair. But it looked wrong. His face was twisted in a strange way, in a permanent cartoonish smile. The face was almost generic looking. It was as if you asked me to draw somebody's face that I had only seen at a distance. A poor imitation. I saw the creature emulating Mark open its mouth inhumanly wide, and then I heard another welcome emit from it. I guess Adam sensed me panicking as I was taking this in, as he ripped the PVS-14s out of my hands. Then handed me his rifle. Then he found some duct tape in his pack, and taped it onto the rifle. So I shouldered it, found the red dot, placed it, and started shooting. The first round was incredibly bright, and I heard the NVG's onboard electronics start to whine in response, attempting to compensate. I fired again, and again. The third round connected to the humanoid, and its head split like a disgusting flower. As if there was no supporting structure in the skull. It shrieked, and none of the beasts could understand how I was accurately shooting them in the darkness. Eventually, they retreated far enough that I could not see them. We moved up and inspected the ground. Black blood was pooled there, and it stunk so much that I gagged. There were body-sized drag marks in the gravel where they pulled away the human-like figure. Not wishing to push our luck, we quickly packed up the bare essentials, and hauled ass out there. Mark was hysterical for hours. We eventually pulled over on the highway to get some sleep after we calmed him down. He gets quiet if you bring it up, and will only talk about it after getting drunk. A few days later it hit me, we almost died a horrible death. I can't sleep, I have nightmares every night. I started taking a variety of meds but it doesn't help. I don't think I'll ever go in the woods again.
B9 or 10, live in Costa Rica. Become a Boy Scout and go camping with the troop frequently, there's lots of cool camping spots around. My 6th or 7th camping trip, I'm a pro by now but it's the most in the woods we've been so far. There's several new, younger kids in the troop though, so we rent a cabin in case it rains overnight. This is a national park so there's some facilities around. Cabin has no power, it's one big empty room with a big, wide window facing the jungle. Do camping shit, set up tents but it starts raining so we decide to spend the night in the cabin. Lay down our sleeping bags on the floor and start fucking around. It's dark and raining, so everyone falls asleep pretty quickly. Wake up in the middle of the night, still raining. Pick related, minus the Chinese guy, is hanging from a branch near the window. Shit myself, close my eyes hard and pray it away. Open my eyes, it's gone. Before I can relax I see it peeking through the window, hanging from the edge of the cabin's roof. It does nothing, watches everyone for a while. Guess I'm not sleeping anymore. After a bit it jumps off into the brush. Everyone else is asleep, I'm too scared to get up. Hear quiet sobbing, so I turn around and it's one of the new kids. Probably 6 or 7. Vacant look, shaking uncontrollably. Doesn't react when I try to wave at him, probably in shock. Hell, I'm in shock too. Figure it's worse to have that thing watch me without me knowing, so turn around again. It returns 3 more times. About 4 AM by now, still raining. The last time it comes it scans the room again, but this time locks eyes with me. Petrified. Gets closer to the window and starts tapping it rhythmically with a single claw. Start crying, accept my death. The thing jumps off again, this time for the last time. I eventually pass out until morning. Wake up next morning. The other kid that was awake had his parents pick him up, didn't see him ever again. Friends didn't believe me, thought it was BS. Couldn't sleep properly for the rest of the trip, but that thing didn't show up anymore. A few years later I became friends with a guy that grew up in that area. He says they're called Las Monas, literally the female chimps. Supposedly there was a coven of aboriginal witches that sold their souls in exchange for power, so they could kill the Spanish conquistadores that were colonizing the New World. They would rip all of their skin off and transform into supernaturally strong beasts that would maul any living thing they came across. The few mentions I found online say that the legend changes from one country to the other. In Nicaragua and Honduras it's a single Mona, for example. But there's been sightings all over Central America. Is there any similar legends/cryptids in North America, or is it a regional creature?
I don't know if anyone is actually enjoying any of what I'm posting, so unless anyone wants to hear others I'll just share this last one. It's about the so-called Dark Walker or Stone Spirit, something like a Bigfoot creature, encountered by a family in Pennsylvania. I received the following correspondence in May 2012. It was forwarded by John, a retired federal employee who lives in northern Nevada and who wishes to remain anonymous. The story centers around an experience John had while living with his grandfather in a rural area of Aleppo Township in Greene County, Pennsylvania. He did not want to pinpoint the location but did say that he wanted the anecdote dedicated to his grandfather, Samuel Hill, who he considers the most remarkable man he has ever known. When I was a boy, my mother and I lived with my grandfather, who had a farmhouse in a rural location in southwestern Pennsylvania. My grandfather was a handyman who also worked a small blacksmith shop in his old barn. My grandmother had died before I was born, and my father had also passed away while serving overseas in the U.S. Army. Beginning in the summer of 1946, we noticed strange howling sounds coming from the woods that surrounded the property. The activity came at night and was very frightening for me and my mother, but the sounds didn't seem to bother my grandfather at all. The sounds continued off and on for about a year, but we never noticed any animals. My grandfather and I would hunt for deer and squirrel in the woods during the colder months, but we never saw signs of unusual animal activity. One late afternoon in the spring of 1947, I was helping my grandfather in his shop, when I noticed something moving around the edge of the woods. It was about 200 feet from our location, and I told my grandfather to look. He walked to the door, lit his pipe, and said nothing. After a minute or two, he turned around and got back to work. After that, the thing moved into the woods and disappeared. I couldn't judge how big it was, but it sort of reminded me of a picture I had seen of a large ape said to inhabit in the Asian jungles. Later that evening, I told my mother what I had seen. She was shocked because she knew I wouldn't lie to her and that the howling sounds had been closer lately. I also told her of my grandfather's response when I pointed the creature out to him. She immediately stood up and walked into the sitting room in order to ask my grandfather what it was. He started to shake his head slowly and said that he was hoping that we wouldn't see it because he was worried we would be scared and leave him. After assuring him that we'd never leave him, my mother again insisted that he tell us what this creature was. He looked away, took a deep breath and said, "It's a dark walker," and said that it had lived in the woods for many years. He said the native Indians called it stone spirit, and that they thought it was an evil spirit that appeared when someone was about to die. The last time he had seen the dark walker was the night before my grandmother died. My mother was skeptical of the harbinger of death angle, but she was still unsettled by the thought of something lurking around in the forest. The howling continued each night, though we hadn't seen any signs of the dark walker. Then, one warm evening, we were sitting on the back porch. There were a few howls, but they seemed far away. We were listening to the radio when all at once my grandfather stood up and looked out towards the barn. He turned to me and said, "John, go get my pistol and ammo, hurry now." I ran into the sitting room and grabbed the .455 Webley revolver and a handful of bullets from the old steamer trunk. I handed it to him and watched him load the gun. He then picked up a hatchet and slid it in his pants belt. "Now both of you get into the house, now." We were in the kitchen looking through the screen door and watched my grandfather walk slowly towards the barn. We saw him turn and walk out of sight into the dark. I decided to grab my shotgun and keep it nearby. After a minute or so, we heard 3 gunshots and a blood-curdling scream emanate from the woods near the barn. Then it suddenly stopped and there was complete quiet. We were frozen and wondering if we should go look for my grandfather. A few seconds later we heard him yell, "Stay in the house until I come back." I heard the pickup truck start up. I looked out the storage room window and saw my grandfather drive to the back of the barn and park. Several minutes later he backed up and drove by the side of the house out onto the road. I could see that there was something in the back of the truck covered up with a tarp. It was getting late, so my mother told me to go to bed. The next morning I came downstairs and sat beside my grandfather, who was reading the newspaper and drinking a cup of coffee. My mother was sitting at the other end of the table staring at my grandfather. After some awkward silence, she said, "Well, Dad, tell him." My grandfather put the paper down and looked at me. "I killed the dark walker." That was all he said. My mother told me not to tell anyone and that the matter was closed. We never talked about it again. My grandfather lived another 15 years and my mother stayed with him until his dying day. When I grew older I moved away and raised a family. I would return home to visit each summer, and never heard another howl. John. Note, I asked John if he thought the Dark Walker was a Bigfoot or hominid. He said he wasn't sure. He thought it seemed more animal-like than human and that it moved lower to the ground, at least during the brief time he observed it. John mentioned that there were Shawnee legends of similar creatures, but he never found a reference to a stone spirit.
Rivers crisscross the Ozarks. Rivers and streams and creeks, their timeless tracks biting deep into the rock of the mountains. In these limestone cracks and hollows the American Indians once sheltered. There's a particular stream, ordinary in most ways, some miles outside Little Rock. It's a beautiful drive, especially in the morning, the mist and fog glowing pink in the early light, almost magic against the mossy green Ozarks. Off the highway, you'll find a winding dirt road, red dust trail worn down by years of travel. On this road you'll find not much but trees, few houses, some lived in, some not. One house, old and abandoned, sits at the top of a ravine. Through the ravine winds an offshoot of some unnamed river, flowing since the ice crawled back north. The stream. In the rocky west bank, there's a cave, like many dotting the area, not more than 15 feet into the earth. Dirt floor, rock walls, paintings. The caves are full of paintings, carvings, the odd arrowhead or bit of bone. In this cave, however, known only to a few, are carvings not like any other ground into the Ozark rock. If you find this road, go down it to this house, wind your way through the woods to that particular stream, and manage to eke out that cave, just let it be. Don't go poking about in it, don't touch the carvings, and if you find any arrowheads, don't move them. If your curiosity gets the better of you, like it did me, go, see, leave. Don't take pictures, don't take the arrowheads, don't touch the carvings. I first heard tell of the cave from my pa. The house belonged to his pa, and to hear him tell it, something was never quite right about the place. Grandpa always had the place strung up in lights, but even so, there were always odd goings-on. Weird noises and shapes liked to flit to and fro in those woods, whispers and shapes that showed themselves to those who looked for them. I remember he once took me back to the old place, not so old back in those days, Grandpa was still alive. He looked at Pa funny, looked at me, and said words that I'll always remember. "You remember the rules, son?" My pa said yes and took me by the hand, through those woods, down the slope, and through the creek. It was fall, then, the creek was low. I followed him up to the cave, and Pa sat me down on the dirt floor to look at the carvings. Weird spirals and curves, all springing out from one image. It looked almost like a man, except where a man had 2 arms and legs, this thing had three legs all arranged even like, 2 arms on one side, and one on the other. It had horns, antlers rather, and 2 big owl eyes. Just describing it, it seems funny, lewd even, like a third leg joke. But it wasn't funny then, and remembering those eyes, it ain't funny now. There was something in those eyes, carved though they were, lines blackened by centuries of smoke and soot, moss, and lichen. Big black eyes that stared out at you from the cave wall, seeing into your soul, Grandpa used to say. I used to have bad dreams about that place. I never really liked Grandpa's, but that cave especially. Those spirals and lines burning into my sleeping mind, and those eyes staring into my soul. Black eyes watches you when you sleep. Back when Grandpa died, I found myself back at the old place for the first time in years. At Grandpa's wake, I wandered off, the sun sitting low in the sky. I had one of the first old picture phones, the really grainy ones. I got the idea in my head to take pictures of the carvings. I didn't know the rules then. I climbed down the ravine and hop-stepped across the creek. Early summer rain had made it swell. I sat down on that old dirt floor and found black eyes there, almost waiting for me. I snapped a few pictures in the here bright light. East Bank has a clear shot at the setting sun. I thought I sensed something change in that cave. Something felt bad where before it just felt sacred, I guess. I crawled out on hands and knees, speeding my way up the ravine, feeling black eyes watching me all the way back. I met up with Pa and the rest of the family in time to sit down. Uncle Justin was standing in front of the old smokehouse and spoke, saying that he knew that this sit-down wasn't planned, but it was strict family business, and anyone not directly related to Grandpa should get back home. Thanks for coming. Once the last of the non-relatives said their confused goodbyes, Justin got back up on his podium. He said that before Grandpa died he hadn't had time to tell some of the younger family members something important, and had included in his will a set of rules for the young UNS. To my surprise, they were about the cave. They were as follows. 1. Don't let anyone who doesn't know the rules into the cave alone. 2. Don't touch the carvings. 3. Don't touch the arrowheads. 4. Don't take any pictures. And that was it, no explanations, none needed. Grandpa was always kind of a kook, one of those old neo-pagans, but had a deep love and respect for the cousins my age. All looked puzzled, but proud, like they were a bit more grown up. My phone sat heavily in my pocket. That night, I stayed in the old room upstairs where I slept during those old visits. The old nightmares came back, the ones with the spirals and lines, and eyes. I woke up to rustling outside. I looked out the second-story window, seeing a pair of antlers and a tuft of tail vanish into the trees. It was a deer, sure enough, but something about the shadows cast by those strings of light gave it an odd quality, like it had too many legs. God, how I didn't know what I was in. The next morning, I left with Pa, and we made our way back home up in West Fork. I fondled my phone the whole ride back. My dad teased me about texting girls and I shakily agreed. We got home, a one-story house sharing some common woods with a few other houses. I unpacked my stuff, played some video games, and when night came around my eyes went back to my phone. It was lying on my pillow where I dropped it after getting back. I approached it cautiously, opened it, and navigated to the picture folder. I opened the thumbnail dated for last night and nearly dropped the phone. Black Eyes was there, but there was something about it that wasn't quite right. The lines seemed almost thicker, the face somehow more defined from the basic oblong. And the eyes were the worst part of all. All around those eyes and horns, the spirals and lines seemed new, almost bright. I snapped the phone shut, plugged it in, and pulled a book out to read. I don't know when I fell asleep, but I remember when I started dreaming. I remember walking through the woods near Grandpa's house, only noticing how the trees started becoming chalkier, straighter, and the foliage spiraling, all seeming carved into the air. The carving trees started getting brighter, almost glowing, and the air between them becoming thick. I walked through the petroglyph forest, and without realizing it I walked out over the ravine. The cave shadow was no longer black, but white. Everything looked like a photo negative, darks and lights swapping places, everything made of those same lines and spirals. I was pulled, into the cave. Inside the awful white shadow cave, there he stood. Black Eyes. No longer some ancient stick figure, it was flesh and blood. Standing on 3 deer legs, a man's torso, 2 man arms, one furred and clawed like a grizzly's. But it was the head that struck me most. If such a thing is possible in dreams, it was round, almost ear-shaped, like a barred owl's. But where a barred owl's face is calm and elegant with an almost chubby feel, this face was gaunt and withered, those wise owl eyes cracked and flat, and utterly staring. From behind those eyes grew 2 deer antlers. All I could feel was pure terror, no malice, just a cold, burning fear bubbling out of those eyes, fear spiraling, growing and shooting out of those eyes. I tried to pull away and run, but Black Eyes stepped forward awkwardly on his 3 legs. It reached out with that grisly arm, whispering. I awoke, still hearing the whispers, staring at the ceiling. In the dark I felt I could almost see spirals and lines, and eyes. The next morning, I looked at my phone again. Black Eyes was there, appearing as it did in my dream. That afternoon when Pa got home from work, I told him about the dreams, sobbing, and showed him my phone. I told him that I didn't know the rules when I took the picture. He looked at the picture, face drained of all color. He looked at me, forcing a smile. Everything's gonna be okay, son. I'll take care of this, don't you worry, everything's gonna be okay. He pocketed my phone, and told me he was going to town for a bit. If you're wondering how I remember all this detail, it's because it was the last time I saw my pa. That night, Uncle Michael picked me up from home, eyes red. I panicked, asked him where my pa was. My pa had been in a car accident, went head-on with one of the trucks that frequent the highway near West Fork. The trucker was okay. The police asked me a few questions before I went home with Uncle Michael. I said nothing about the nightmares or pictures, nothing about black eyes. My phone was eventually returned to me. I checked it, the picture from a few nights before was gone. The police say my pa died with a smile on his face. They said it was a smile of defiance, like he thought he could take out a Peterbilt with his station wagon. I know different. My pa died for me that night. Black eyes watches you while you sleep, watches for you to die. If you find that cave by that creek, don't go in, touch nothing, and don't take any pictures.
Not my story, but my Uncle Nick used to tell us this as kids to scare us. Be Uncle Nick. 1983. 17-year-old. Working at a fast food joint in a small town in Ohio. Be working late shift on a summer night. Till about 11:30 or so. Ends up getting off an hour later due to how busy it was. Drives home in a beat-up hand-me-down he, my dad, and grandpa fixed up. Takes a shortcut through some back road back to the house he lived at with the family. Slam his foot on the brake when this big deer comes bolting across the road. The deer isn't the only thing to appear in the headlights. Out comes this big, hair-covered thing as he called it, leaping down onto the road. Holds a five-fingered, man hand as Nick calls it up to its face. This creature is built like a fucking quarterback and pro wrestler combined. Today it would be called an absolute unit. It's about a few seconds long encounter, but he manages to see its face for 1 second. It's wolf-like. He sees the wolf-like face and backs up and barrels the fuck out. Fast forward some time later. I'm 6. Uncle Nick is now 41. My littler sister is 8. It's Halloween. He tells us he saw a real werewolf. Years later I'm 16 in high school. Look up werewolf sightings out of boredom. Remember Uncle Nick's story? Learn about Dogman. Tell him what I looked up. He still tells the story every Halloween.
Got a green text story if anyone's interested of an encounter I had about 5 years ago. B19. Spring turkey hunt with Dad and Grandpa. Peabody Coal Fields, Western Kentucky. Dad drops me off into a pine barren final evening to try and shoot a gobbler before they get to roost. Set up close to a small bank overlooking a clear side, we saw them leaving from here this morning. 40 minutes, nothing. Almost dark. Hear sudden heavy footfalls. Thump 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 thump. About 50 yards away, a big-ass wolf dog the size of a cow is wandering around. I have the weirdest boner right for some reason unknown to man. Wolf dog starts to mess with an old beer can. I am seriously paralyzed in denial of what I am seeing. Not a coyote, I've hunted many coyotes before. This thing is fucking giga wolf. It starts to move closer to me. Nope. I bolt down the hill, I hear a snarl behind me, I keep face forward to avoid cutting the shit out of me on Brayers. I can hear behind me though. Jump the ditch line and roll onto the gravel road, 12 gauge at the ready. Giga wolf is just about to jump the ditch. I pull the trigger. A holy orgasm of fire erupts from my 12 gauge 3.5-inch shell. Feel like a badass for exactly a millisecond. Pump another round in, about to fire when I see it turn tail and run back up the hill. I sigh in relief, and I head straight to our RV to tell Dad. He doesn't believe me, says I probably just saw a deer. Grandpa kind of does, says anything could be out there with as much woods as there are. Did I see some ancient lycanthrope Indian monster, /x/? Thump 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 thump. I have the weirdest boner right for some reason unknown to man. A holy orgasm of fire erupts from my 12 gauge 3.5-inch shell. Pump another round in. I sigh in relief. Did you intend for this story to be so erotic?
Here's one from living in rural South Carolina. I've got more if you'd like to hear. This happened a few years ago, when I was a community college student and still dating my now wife. I lived at my parents' house at the time, in a rural area of upstate South Carolina. The area we lived in was rural. but not terribly sparsely populated. Our road had houses every few hundred feet, with thick bands of trees between them. Most other roads in the region were similar to this. Houses every so often, with thick forest interspersed regularly. We lived 5 minutes from the closest town. However, my college and GFS residence were in a larger town about 40 minutes away by the fastest route. This route was along just 3 of those sparsely populated roads, one after the other. Driving on this route would take you first to another small town around 20 minutes away, and then after 15 to 20 more to the larger city where my college was. If you were heading to the college, the first 10 minutes of your drive were guaranteed to be down a twisting, dark, and often empty road, with long stretches between clusters of houses. This road had an official name that can be found on a map. However, I'll call it what it was designated by the locals: Snake Road. Called so because of its winding nature, there were a few low spots along this road where at night it became particularly dark and hard to see, and sometimes foggy. In one of these low spots, there was an area I always felt odd driving through, even in the daylight. If you looked out the window, the trees and underbrush were fairly sparse, but at the same time impossible to see more than a few meters into. It was almost as if the light was twisted and distorted by all of the branches and vines. At night, the only visibility would come from my headlights, which were fortunately bright, modern ones that could illuminate several hundred feet in front of the car on most roads. But in this low-lying area, for reasons I never understood, they could never penetrate more than 70 or 80 feet into the thick shadows. One night, I had stayed late at my GF's house after class. As usual, I had tucked her in and was heading home in my car. At this point, everything was fine. I had a full tank of gas, my lights were in good condition, and I had some good CDs to listen to help me stay awake on my drive home. Although it was a long drive in daylight, with normal traffic, at night I could speed and so usually make it home a good bit faster. However, this reward of being in bed sooner came with a price of potentially running into deer or other nocturnal animals, which frequently cross the roads at night. Deer were particularly threatening, as they are large enough here that if you strike them at any pace higher than a crawl, they will destroy your lights, radiator, bumper, and perhaps even parts of your engine or windshield. I had seen a deer jump into another car and shatter its window as a child, so I fully understood the threat and made sure to be as observant as possible when speeding home. I hastily drove out of the outskirts of the city where she lived and began to drive into the countryside. I watched as all the familiar turns passed me by. Because I was still so close to the city, many houses still had their lights on, and I had passed a few cars. It was a typical night drive, and my biggest worries were a stray deer or sheriff's deputy. However, neither of these were particularly prescient at the moment, because on the wide, well-maintained roads near the city, my bright headlights made it easy for me to see along any stretch or curve, as well as several feet off to either side of the road. After around 15 minutes, I reached the small town that marked the midpoint of my darkened commute. I rolled through the stop sign in the middle of town and continued out into the countryside. I was making good time, and nothing out of the ordinary had occurred yet. However, I had to become more reliant on my lights, as this small town marked the end of the wide, well-maintained highway and the start of a narrower, darker portion, mostly surrounded by trees, farms, and the odd church, instead of neighborhoods, gas stations, and stores. The next 5 minutes of my drive were uneventful enough. At this point I was nearly on autopilot, singing along to an old Midnight Oil CD and watching my odometer tick onwards. After a long straight section where there were wide, cleared sections on either side where the grass ran to meet the forest hundreds of feet away from the road, I rounded the last bend and came upon my second to last turn. The turn onto Snake Road. I slowed down as the junction with Snake Road was marked by a sharp hairpin where the ground dipped away swiftly on either side. Taking the turn too fast would send you careening into the ditch, a sign of the nature of the test of the road. As I turned, I followed the first steep, winding descent into a low-lying area with several farms in the vicinity. I had seen many deer in this area before, as they fed on the crops, and my headlights were also beginning to lose their piercing edge, as I mentioned previously. At this point I had slowed down to around 45 miles per hour, as I knew a slower pace was preferable to striking a deer and having to walk to find signal to call my parents. The road led up over another hill, past a large white house, and dipped once more into the darkest part of the road. This was the area I mentioned earlier, where even daylight was hazy and unreliable. Coming around the downward curve into the bottom, I was on a shorter straightaway, before a long left-hander into a longer straight, and then a hill. It was here that I had my encounter. I saw movement up ahead, at the very end of the straight, before it turned to the left. I instinctively slowed the car, as hitting a deer at 45 is enough to do serious damage. As I approached, I saw what I thought was a deer walking off of the road. I could see the vague shape of its head and antlers, as well as my lights reflecting from its eyes. But something was wrong. The deer's head was too low to the ground. Deer will frequently lower their heads to graze, so this isn't unusual, but if they're grazing, their mouths will face downwards. This deer was almost lying on the ground, moving and looking at me. Okay, I thought to myself, a scavenger is probably dragging away some roadkill. But as I approached, this was clearly not the case. I saw another set of eyes turn to look at me. Deer's eyes are big and green at night in headlights because they reflect the color green. These eyes were small and piercingly bright, like two coals. As I got closer, I saw an enormous shadow imposed over the deer carcass. It was about waist high and pure black. Standing on all fours looking at me, its legs were thick, not fatty like a bear's, but sinewy like a dog's, only much thicker. Attached to the legs was a massive, pitch-black muscular torso and powerful neck, easily holding the deer just off the ground. Throwing caution to the wind, I floored it. Any risks that might occur were surely lesser than whatever creature was staring right at me in my car. I whizzed past it, the whole encounter taking only a few seconds. I made it to my house several minutes later, ran inside and locked the door. The next day, I drove to school along the same route. In daylight, I felt much safer and could try to catch a glimpse of whatever I had crossed paths with the night before. Driving past the same spot, I did not feel the same sense of dread the night before. I began to feel somewhat relieved until I saw the deer carcass. What had previously been a good-sized animal was not simply a head, neck, and part of a rib cage. The rest was simply gone, torn clean off. Coyotes can't do that. Vultures merely pick corpses. They don't eat bones. And the bears around here are scavengers. Which leaves me wondering, what else is in those woods along Snake Road?
I've got Maori, native New Zealander, blood, and I went to a family gathering around Christmas when I was younger, the family being on my mother's side. where I get the Maori blood from. This gathering was way up in North New Zealand, which is mostly just Maori land and is rural as all fuck. No shit, as me and my family pull into the farm it's being held on, there's a boar on a spit. Some of the uncles, adults were just called aunties and uncles, had caught earlier in the day using spears and knives. Anyway, there's a creek, stream that runs through the property, which the kids went down to and swam in most days. A lot of the time we'd all let ourselves float down a while on inflatables or just by the current. At one point on the bank on the farm side was about 2 meters high or so, but there was a small ledge about halfway down that you could get down on from the top but not the bottom. Me and 2 other boys reckoned it would be a brilliant idea to use that ledge for eeling. We told the adults and they just shrugged and told us to knock ourselves out. So me and these 2 guys, we go to this ledge a fucking bunch, using those hand casters, pick related, and having fun chilling in this picturesque place, surrounded by rolling hills, green fields and bushland. Us 3 boys even found a cool place further down the stream no else went to, where only we would hang. But then it got weird. A few times out swimming all of the kids got a little anxious, and there was a couple of times we could swear we saw a figure standing on the far bank as we floated down the stream. It got to the point where me and the 2 guys were out eeling. We hadn't caught anything so far, which was weird because this stream should have been essentially untouched, and we saw a shadowy figure step out and walk towards us on the opposite bank, then begin walking across the water. Of course we shit ourselves and book it out of there. I remember being in complete terror. We told some of the older adults, elders, about this and they seemed a little concerned, even when they dismissed it as it was probably just the farmer from the next property. But unless that farmer was Jesus from the shadow realm, I didn't buy that shit. Anyway, us boys had only been eeling during daylight hours, and we wanted to go out at night, because that's the best time to catch eels. One of the older cousins, early 20s, said he'd come along, and about 6 girls begged to come along too. So 10 or so people go out at night to catch some eels, all crammed onto this tiny ledge. We're there for a few hours, the girls complaining about being bored while us boys told them to STFU, worried they'll scare off the eels. That's when one of the girls gets a tug on her line. A tug that nearly pulled her off the ledge into the inky black waters beneath us. The older cousin grabs on and starts pulling the line. He's digging his feet in and struggling. Me and the other 2 boys grab on too, all trying to yank this line up, thinking we hit the jackpot. A couple minutes go by when we get some progress, slowly pulling the line in. One of the girls turned on a light, but that's all over the place because they're all screaming and freaking out and shit. But I noticed something long and really thick being pulled out of that water, with no indication of ending. An immense eel head eventually crests the ledge. This motherfucker was huge, slightly thicker than the one in the picture and way longer. This thing is a meter out of the water and still looks to have most of its body in the water. But this fat fucker's head is only over this ledge for a couple seconds when it lets out a fucking roar, a little like a dog bark but way fucking louder, and the line snaps as it slides back over the ledge and splashes into the water. We're stunned, and the older cousin tells us we all have to go back. So we walk back through the dark, a little disappointed, but also a little frightened. We swim in that creek, and a giant eel that fucking roars lives in it. When we got back, we told the elders our story excitedly, with them nodding and wowing, but they didn't seem surprised and actually seemed relieved, but told us we weren't to eel in the stream anymore. After that, we didn't see the Shadowman again, but not long before my family left whilst out swimming felt something thick and slimy slide past my leg when we were near the ledge, and looking back on it I'm convinced as to what that eel was. In Maori legend, folklore, there is a creature called the Taniwha, pronounced Ta-Nifa, which guards certain areas in nature or is a guardian for tribes and sub-tribes, in which case it is called a Kotiaki, guardian. They generally take the form of sharks if in the sea, or an eel in freshwater. I think that the elders were concerned the Shadow Man was an evil spirit or ghost, and made an offering or summoned a Taniwha Kotiaki to protect us kids, and that eel was it giving us a warning, specifically that bark. Other stories I've heard about Taniwha have mentioned the roaring sound as well. I want to go back there in a couple of years and try and make an offering, even if it isn't a Taniwha and is just an eel. That bitch has to be about 80 to 100 years to be that big, and deserves respect.